I was asked several questions, and I thought I'd begin by addressing them. What is the role of the Divine Mother at Ananda? It's an important question to understand, first of all, that Divine Mother is not a separate thing or person. It's all God, an infinite consciousness that has produced many different types of manifestations of one divine awareness. The Divine Mother is the feminine aspect of God, and in all things there has to be a balance. It came to me in meditation some years ago that really what America needs is more of the Divine Mother consciousness to balance out the masculine consciousness. Because when you, as a simple example, if you cross the border from Mexico, where they're much more into their hearts, into this country, what you notice very much is it's so mental, too much mental. You know, they've discovered in science that the heart actually has intelligent cells, brain cells, that are not only in the brain itself, but here, that you use your heart to be aware that it's far more than just a blood pumping organ. Behind the heart is what is called in the yoga teachings the chakra, or center of energy, from which love springs, from which love wells up. And you've never, ever heard of any broken-hearted young swain, let us say, saying, "Oh, my knee hurts." When we feel deep emotion, it's always in the heart. The heart is the most important part of real understanding, and this is why in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, they say, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirod. Yoga is the neutralization of the vortices of Chitta, which many books translate as merely consciousness, but it's that particular aspect of consciousness, as Paramhansa Yogananda explained, that addresses feeling. Without feeling, you don't understand, and with feeling, if it's upset and excited, you don't understand correctly. Emotion is very different from feeling. But anytime, I've noticed this in writing music, that I have to consult my heart. I used to wonder, in fact, when I used to go to Brown University, not that far away from here. I left. I had about 6 months to go to finish it. And I left, I took a leave of absence, never went back, never regretted not going back. I felt that my education began when I left Brown University. If anybody here is a professor there, please forgive me. But the fact is that I just felt that there was much too much emphasis on the mind as an instrument for understanding. You can understand many things with the mind. It's essential that you use your brain, but you never really know. Mental, intellectual understanding is like this. You finally get a big breakthrough. Now I understand. A week later you think, now what was that thing that I understood? It doesn't do it. What really gives you understanding is when the heart and the mind, heart and the intellect work together. I found there, for example, studying philosophy, well, I ended up just taking a book of poetry to class and reading it. I was so fed up with that mental analysis of everything, which gave no understanding, produced intelligent idiots. And I felt that, for example, Plato, who was a great philosopher, but nonetheless there was something wrong there, because it was all predicated on the thought that if you can explain a thing clearly, people will understand. If you can get people to respond to your questions in such a way, you can bring them all to understanding. But it isn't like that. I used to feel again and again there's something drastically missing. Here we have, yes, the possibility of answering a question, which seems like a well-put question, and answering it in the right way. Is it better to be kind than mean? Certainly it's better to be kind. But then they go on and on and on. Each time they don't refer back to the original premise. They keep going until the point where you begin to think, well, wait a minute now, I want to know where we're going. One is not satisfied until he can really feel in his heart that, yes, this is the answer. In fact, I remember I went to Charleston, South Carolina, and was studying, working to become a playwright and acting in the theater there at the Dock Street Theater to get a feel for stagecraft and so on. And I wasn't satisfied. I wanted to uplift people. I wanted to give them inspiration. And I realized that I didn't know anything. What was I doing dumping my ignorance on other people? And I was already tottering on the edge of deciding not to write again, which I did decide. For 20 years I didn't write. But I went out into the night one time, and I was asking myself, what is God? I had always thought about God, but I couldn't feel whether he existed or not. And so I was trying to, yes, analyze. Sure, you have to use your brain. But I was asking myself, what is God? I said, well, he has to be conscious for one thing, or he wouldn't be God. Some wooden idol obviously isn't God. He has to be conscious, but if he's conscious, then consciousness is something that pre-exists the creation of this body, and that consciousness pre-exists my ability to be conscious, and consciousness, therefore, is something that doesn't depend upon a physical organ in order to think. It exists already. And my consciousness, and your consciousness, obviously, but I was thinking, who am I? Has to be a part of that, has to be a manifestation of that consciousness. Well then, what kind of consciousness? Some consciousness is evil, hateful, full of anger. Other consciousness is expansive, full of love, full of wisdom. And I realized that if it's limited with anger, emotion, all the things that we consider dark, it's also self-limiting. Whereas this consciousness has to embrace everything because we're all conscious. If that consciousness that is in everybody is what everybody expresses, then that which embraces everybody, which expands our consciousness to include other people's needs and so on, has to be a clearer indication of what God's consciousness is, and that which cuts us off from other people, cuts us off from that which God is. And therefore, that means that if I use my consciousness just to think me, just to think how can I get even with somebody else or get the best of somebody else, then there's something wrong. I'm not in tune with what that broader consciousness is. And it seemed to me then self-evident in my thinking that the only thing in life is to try to tune in to that infinite consciousness, that has to be the purpose of life, and that the more close I come to that, the more I will be what I want to be, which is happy, understanding, loving. And with this thought, it was so staggering that I remember my brain was reeling with the greatness of this idea. But I decided from then on, the only thing worth doing with life is to seek God, to try to attune myself to Him, to try to feel Him guiding my thoughts. And the more I can express Him, the more I'll have what I want. The more I cut myself off from Him, the less I'll have what I want. This seemed to me so self-evident, but I didn't quite understand yet, because I was very intellectual, the importance of love. And it was when I met Yogananda, yes, partly that. It was also when I looked at myself, and I realized that for all my thinking, and I'd been thinking all for years, what is life all about? You may call me crazy, and probably I was, but I just was too heady. And I was not happy. And I looked back to when I was a little child. And I thought, why was I so happy then? And what's wrong with me now? Why don't I feel happiness? For all the deep thoughts I have, why am I not happy? I said, I want to leave all that stuff. I just want to be a little child again. And it was at this time that I read Autobiography of a Yogi. I was in Scarsdale. My father was an oil geologist, and he'd been sent to Cairo, Egypt. And I just put my mother on the ship that day to go to Cairo to join him. In those days, they didn't travel by plane. And that same day, I came up New York, up to Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street or wherever it was, and I found a bookstore there. And in this bookstore, I found Autobiography of a Yogi. Well, I've shortened the story a bit because I don't want to take up your time on all that, because the essence of it is that I found that book. And I read this thing really between tears and laughter. It was so wonderful. Tears of joy, laughter of joy, everything was so thrilling. I took the next bus non-stop from New York all the way to California. And I met Yogananda there. And the first words I addressed to him were, I want to be your disciple. I've never regretted that choice. Many times when people make lightning changes in their lives, they make just as lightning changes in the opposite direction. But this was no lightning change. It only looked like that. I had been thinking this way for years, and finally I'd found that philosopher's stone I was looking for. And I have to say, too, that he never disappointed me. This is one of the things that I've grieved when I found people going different ways, not different from this, but various ways, and been disillusioned in one way or another. He never disillusioned me. He was always far greater than my own image of what greatness ought to be. He was so completely human, so completely humble, so completely compassionate, and yet such a great sense of humor. And human in the sense of inspiringly so, and not in the sense of, we think people say, well, I'm only human. No, that wasn't the way he was at all. He was more than human. We won't be completely human until we have discovered who we are. And who we are, we don't have any existence except as a part of that infinite reality. You're born a few years ago, you live for a few years, you check out. Is it over when you check out? No. You've been around just as long as God has. That's a scary thought. But it's also a very inspiring thought, because when you feel that, God, I don't know if I can stand this suffering anymore, this test, these enemies, these obstacles, these difficulties, I don't know how long I can do it. You've got to sit back and realize you've been doing it for billions and billions of years. And it's waves going up and down, but you, at your core, remain completely untouched by anything. This was a part of what I was going through back then in Charleston, South Carolina. I'd suddenly watch myself. I'd see myself talking to people, laughing, joking, and I was watching it. And that's who we really are, that inner part that sits and watches and sometimes thinks, what a fool, why can't you wake up? And sometimes thinks, well done, Charlie, that's the way it should be. But it really is something within you that never changes. And you will always be, this is another beautiful thing. Because yes, God is your reality. He created you and He's the only you. Although you've got all sorts of definitions that you've added to yourself, that I'm female, I'm male, I'm American, I'm Canadian, I'm French, I'm Italian, I'm a businessman, I'm an artist, I'm this, I'm that. None of those are you. It's sort of like peeling an onion. You get rid of all the peels, there's nothing left. But that nothingness is a no-thingness, not nothingness. When you reach that point, then you realize that there is a germ of individuality, the self, which has always been there, always been watching this show, never touched by any of it. That's the goal of all striving. Now, when you realize that, you realize that you, who were Leonore or whoever, have suddenly, you realize it was God who was that form. It was God who was in all those forms. They say in the Indian scriptures that God created himself that he might enjoy himself through many. And you think, now, wait a minute, look at all those people who died and suffered in concentration camps. Look at people who have terrible accidents and live in pain the rest of their lives. Think of the cruelty, think of the uncertainty and tragedy of life, and you think that's enjoying himself? No. But you know what it's like? Here's a very good illustration. Supposing you have a novel, and the hero is born on the right side of the tracks, and he gets to go into a business and quickly rises to become the president's right-hand man. He meets the president's wife, and they fall in love, daughter, they fall in love, and he marries her, and he becomes the head of the company, and he owns everything, and everybody admires him, and he's got a wonderful wife and wonderful children and wonderful home and wonderful this. My God, what a boring story. But now you take the same person and put him on the wrong side of the tracks. And he's got to struggle and struggle against poverty and difficulty of getting an education, and finally he gets a job in a company, and he's just a peon in the company, but with intelligence and creativity he rises and finally reaches the point where he marries the president's daughter, and he becomes successful, and all the same things that the other guy had at the end, but trouble is also at the beginning. And everybody says, oh, what a good story. Isn't it true? Well, that's how life is. That if it were all just a pathway of roses, you'd think, what a bore. But you yourself, and it's not that God gives you suffering, but you yourself have to understand who you are. And that's what it's all about. And so God, through each one of you, has to go through all these things, so that this person, Larry, may have been a pirate, and Karen may have been a great singer in the Ferris Opera, and who knows what. All the different things, but each one, Larry will be a special kind of pirate. He will be his kind of pirate, and she will be a special kind of chanteuse, or singer, or opera star, or whatever. Each person will be himself, always. And what you realize at the end of it all is that it all was just to learn this simple truth. None of this is real. I am a part of the infinite, and it was God who played this particular role. God is unique in each one of us. He has his own song to sing through each one of us. That's the wonderful thing about this great drama, that you realize that you are God. But you can't say, what, this body is God? No. This personality? No. But God is you. This is correct to say. And so in the end, self-realization means to realize that the whole universe, which was produced by that divine consciousness, is a part of your own reality. That you are billions of years old, that you are infinite in your basic intelligence, in your basic potential, and all this pettiness and all this ability to suffer and feel and so on is just a small thing. Now, what is Divine Mother? You are Divine Mother. There can't be any difference. There's no separation in the infinite. When God brought this universe into existence, he could only do it out of his own consciousness. He had to dream it into existence. Now, the beauty of that is that all the love of the universe is a part of you. Now, what part does Divine Mother play in this? Well, it's not wise to say, well, if I am to love God, I should love myself. Because what that does is you've got a hold of the wrong self. If you start thinking that I love me, you're thinking ego. And so it's helpful to think of God as something outside and separate from. But the difference between human love and divine love is this, that human love tends to take the infinite and condense it in one person. It's good in a sense, because it gives you a concentration of love. Without that, it would be vague. I had this experience when I was a boy of 17 in Scarsdale, and I bought a typewriter, and I wanted to learn the touch system, and so I bought a little book, and I was doing the various exercises for a week to make it subconscious habit, and I thought, well, I want to be a writer. I don't want to worry about numbers. And so I was so eager to learn the letters and the placement of the letters, I decided to just sort of forget about the numbers. I told myself I'll learn their positions later. And so for 1 week, I did the exercises necessary to help me to know where the letters were. Well, it's now how many years since then? A fair amount. I still don't know where those numbers are. I still have to look. I can type a mile a minute, but I have to look to see where the numbers are. You see, we need concentration of principles. We can't just think, oh, it's all God, it's all wonderful. This is why you need a path even though you don't need a path. This is why you need a guru even though you don't need a guru. This is why you need a concept of God even though you don't need a concept. But you need them as stepping stones or steps on a ladder to bring you up to that point where suddenly you see that it's all He. This was a story that I told in the path. It was about a great saint in India called Namdev. And he was a great saint, and many people loved him, but he wasn't a master yet. And he used to worship in the temple, and Krishna actually the form of Krishna would actually assume form, as God has sometimes done for his devotees, because Namdev worshipped Krishna in form, so Krishna would speak to him. And there was another saint in that same town, and he was a potter by profession. And you know how potters, well, I'll tell you first of all, there was this big congregation of disciples and students and everything of both of these saints gathered together in one place. You know how potters like to test a pot to see if it's got a crack in it? So this potter, on some sort of divine whim, got up and started slapping everybody in the crowd as if he was testing them their pot. And he came to Namdev and he slapped him, and Namdev's natural instinct, as still an ego, was, I'm not your student, what are you doing slapping me? And so the potter, when he slapped Namdev, Nam said, what did you do that for? And the potter stood up calmly. He said, there appears to be a crack in this pot. And Namdev was very humiliated. Everybody laughed. And he went to the temple later and he prayed to Krishna. And he said, Lord, why did you let me to be humiliated in front of all these devotees? And the Lord answered him. He said, well, I can't help it. There is a crack in your pot. And so Namdev said, well, Lord, I want to know you. I don't want to have any delusions. Help me. And Krishna said, no, I can't help you. I can inspire you, but I can't give you that kind of understanding which comes with realization. And so Namdev said, well, then tell me what to do. And Krishna said, well, you have to find a guru. So he said, well, at least tell me where to find a guru. Well, Krishna said, that I'm entitled, I'm allowed to do. So he told him, he said, you'll find him in such and such a town, and don't worry if he seems a little strange, that's just his way. Well, anyway, he went to this town and asked people where this man was to be found. And everybody said, oh, that crazy fellow, who would want to see him? Well, when he insisted, he said, okay, you'll probably find him hanging out around the temple somewhere. So he went there, and the temple was empty, and there was no saint around. All he saw was some beggar lying on the ground, and awful horror of horrors, lying in such a position that his feet were pointed toward the altar. Well, in Indian, according to Indian tradition and so on, that's a great insult to sit with your feet toward anything that you revere. And so he stormed over to this beggar, or whatever he was, old man, and he said, "How dare you lie like this with your feet toward the altar? Turn around." And the man looked up sleepily and he said, "Well, my son, you see, I'm getting old. It's difficult for me to move. If you don't like my feet pointed there where the altar is, please you move them to some place where there isn't an altar." And so Namdev just instantly picked up his feet and put them down over here, and he saw the whole temple had turned. The altar was still where the feet were. And so he tried it again 2 or 3 times, and suddenly he realized, well, this must be this man I was told to see. And so he asked him to initiate him, and the man became stalwart and strong, and was no longer playing the role of a sick and tired old man. And he touched him and gave him samadhi. And Namdev was in such bliss in the presence of God that he roamed the countryside and never went back to his own temple even. And finally he happened to be in the area where that temple was. And he went in, and for old time's sake only, he prostrated before the image of Krishna and prayed to him. And Krishna said, "My child, where have you been? I've missed you." And Namdev said, "Well, Lord, everywhere I go, I see you. How can I come here to look for you?" And Krishna said, "Now there are no cracks in that pot." So you see that God is everywhere, and we need to have that consciousness. But if we think of him as here, how are we going to think of him as everywhere? Human love is limiting, but it's necessary. You need images. You need a beloved, or friends, or people who express God to you in ways that inspire you. Like one time I met Ernest Wood. I don't know if any of you have read his books, but he wrote on yoga and so on, and I didn't know anything about him. But he happened to be the president of a university that I was supposed to go and ask him if he would allow an Indian teacher to come and speak. I won't go into the details of that, except for this fact that after my talk with him, and he was a pleasant fellow, there was nothing special about it, but on the freeway as I was driving, I remembered his eyes. And I thought, wow, those were great eyes. There was something of joy, there was something of wisdom. That's what you find when you see human beings who express that. And if you say, "Oh, I won't look at anybody, I don't want any master, I don't want to bow before anybody," they'll never bow to even themselves. To be able to see God pinpointed in a beloved, in a friend, in a wise person, in anything that reminds you of something more, this is good. That's why we worship the Divine Mother, because whereas human love is limiting, Divine Mother's love is expansive. So don't think that in worshiping the Divine Mother we think in terms of a human form, except to get us started. I know that when I was first praying to God as the Divine Mother, because I wanted to develop devotion, I was sick of just being intellectual. And I used to visualize the face of my godfather's wife. Now that may seem ridiculous, but she had a very sweet consciousness, a very sweet nature, and that reminded me of the innocence and sweetness that I was trying to develop. In that way, I gradually saw that that's not Divine Mother. I knew it all the time. But when I think of Divine Mother now, I don't think of a form. Like a great song of a devotee in Bengal, Ram Prasad, who said, "Ore shotto 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 ved tara amar nirakara." Thousands of scriptures declare that my Divine Mother has no form. So we don't think of Divine Mother as having a form. We think of it as an aspect of the infinite. But the trouble with worshiping God only as Father is that he tends to be the judge. He tends to be somewhat stern. The Divine Mother will forgive you even if you've done wrong. As Master said, pray to the Mother, naughty or good, still I'm your child and you must help me. When we think of the Divine Mother, it's easier to visualize that. I don't mean impossible. You can worship a sacred alligator. It doesn't matter. God is all forms and no form. But I don't ask people, what form do you worship God in? I don't ask the people at Ananda to worship God as Divine Mother. I think that many of them do. I do, but I don't say you have to or you should even. Because in each one of us there is some form that deeply satisfies us. There was a very interesting story of Sri Yukteswar, and I've mentioned it in my new book, A Place Called Ananda, where there was a disciple of Sri Yukteswar who just always had this longing for human love. And they were in a train one day when Sri Yukteswar said, Divine Mother will answer your prayer today. And they came to a station and were stopped there. And he said, look out the window. And there was a girl sitting in the train opposite them as the train was just pulling out, that somehow was the complete satisfaction of his desire. And from then on he had no more desire for human love. We need the limited to remind us of the infinite. But everything you do, and even when you pray to God, if God should come to you as a Divine Mother, if God should come to you as a friend, if God should come to you as a beloved or the Father, always see in those eyes, and that's what Master used to teach, look for the infinite consciousness behind those eyes. I used to notice this with Yogananda, because he could be laughing joyfully, he could be scolding, he could be teaching, he could be talking about a pothole that needed fixing in the driveway. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw that there was no personal desire, likes or dislikes. It was as if the infinite was looking at me through those eyes. And I'll never forget one time I was sitting at his feet and he was editing a manuscript. And he got through working with it, and I was thinking all the time how fortunate it was that I had found him. And when he finished his writing, his editing, he asked me to help him stand, and he looked into my eyes, and with so much joy and love, he said, just a bulge of the ocean. I was loving the form, but it was the ocean that had produced that form. It was the ocean that had produced all our forms. Ultimately, love of Divine Mother is only love of your own true self. That's what it's all about. And you need to always bring it back to that reality, not in self-love, not in ego love, but in the realization that not only God is everywhere, that's his business, but you are everywhere, and that is your business. You are in everything. You've lived all these billions of years through all these experiences. You are in everything. As Master wrote in a letter to his chief disciple, Rajarshi Janakananda, who was advanced enough to be able to do this, that he said, don't just look with your physical eyes. Think of the things behind you and try to see them. Try to see the things that are out of your range of physical vision, and that way you will develop, bit by bit, omnipresence. This is how we worship Divine Mother. But it's also a conscious thing in this sense that there is need for more love. Without love, you don't understand anything. I know in writing music, it's one of the best ways I have of realizing this truth, that until I feel it here, it's not right. When I feel it here, Mozart himself could tell me I had the wrong chord. I'd say, sorry, this is right. And it's surprising too, because I really am not a musician. There are millions of people who know more about music than I did. Yes, I did take music composition at Brown University, but I hardly ever went to class, and I did about 3 assignments. The only thing I came away with was the two concepts that you shouldn't have parallel fifths, and I found that sometimes they work. And that it's a good thing for the bass line to go in the opposite direction from the treble line when you can. Well, it's not much to take away from a whole semester. No, I don't know composition, but I know what I'm doing when I'm composing. How do I know? Because I hear it. God gives me these sounds. You know that Chant of the Angels? Many of you know that record that I made. It's quite a complex piece. I wrote it in one day. And I did it because I could hear. I haven't any idea what the chords are, but they work. They're the right chords. When you pray and you bring your heart into it, this is what I'm trying to say, I'm not boasting, but when you consult your heart, somehow if your heart is calm, not emotional, you feel what is right, what should I do? Some people ask, what path should I follow? Consult your heart. The only thing I'd say is that if you don't know what path to follow, follow something. But you'll find in time that with that clarity, you'll know. And if somebody comes to me and tells me, well, I've been following Yogananda for so many years and I feel that this isn't my path, fine. I'm not interested in converting people except to their own higher self. That I want to do. And the more clear you are, you'll know. But in everything you do, you need that kind of clarity where you feel in your heart, this is the right thing, this is the answer. God wants to give you these things. It's not as if you were doing it, but when you put the will out, you put the heart into it, you find that He does, in fact. I was so amazed when I was writing the Festival of Light, and many of you know the Festival of Light. Those of you who will be here tomorrow who haven't seen it will see it then. But I was writing this thing in Assisi, Italy, where St. Francis lived. And all of a sudden, after finishing a prayer that was very exalted, very scriptural, comes from the Sanskrit scriptures, and I was just listening. And all of a sudden I heard the words in my mind, a little bird flew out into the world. And I thought, my God, what has that got to do with anything? I thought, no, okay, I'll just follow it and see where it leads. And this wonderful story, this allegory evolved, which was totally unexpected to me. It wasn't like automatic writing. It was just cooperating with the inspiration and the flow. But then I really thought I'd blown it at one point. When that song, The Thunder of Om, came, it was so completely different from anything I'd ever written. Out of the silence came the song of creation. Oh my God, that's not my kind of music. But I let it go on and I thought, hey, this is great. Oh, it's often like that, when I'm lecturing too, I think, gosh, I wish I'd thought of that. Because the truth is that you have a higher self. And if you open yourself to it and then put yourself into it, don't just wait for it to come. I remember back in Los Angeles when I was in the SRF Church of Hollywood, and I was giving a lecture there. And I remembered that Yogananda had said that you should let God speak through you. So I said, well, fine. God, I'll just stop talking and you talk. So, you know, if you stop talking in the middle of a lecture and there are 100 people there, the time changes its dimension very much. A few seconds begin to seem awfully long. And I stood there perfectly comfortable. I wasn't at all nervous, but I stood there for 2 minutes. People were sitting there with sweat coming. They thought I'd frozen. But I was really just simply waiting for God to do His thing. And I finally had to realize that God doesn't do it that way. Yogananda said, I will reason, I will will, I will act, but guide thou my reason, will, and activity in the right path in everything. We have to do it. We have to do it ourselves. But we have to do it with His inspiration, with His guidance. And so when you do your best and keep inwardly asking God, you'll find that He will guide you. And it's like a muscle. Muscles don't develop just for lifting one barbell and falling flat on your nose. They develop with practice and time, but bit by bit you find that that guidance is there and it works. And also you'll know there's a certain feeling that comes to you that's calm, that's uplifted, there's a deep peace in it. You know when it's guidance and when it's your own imagination. You don't always know. You have to be careful, you have to use common sense. Yogananda, in fact, even he is a master, probably to show us the way to do this, when he was going out in 1950 to write his interpretations of different scriptures, Omar Khayyam and so on. He said, I prayed to Divine Mother, whom I should take with me to help me, and your face appeared, Walter. He called me Walter. Then I asked her twice more. And each time your face appeared. Well, you know, there are two ways of thinking of this. One is, oh no, for God's sake, not Walter. The other way, which I prefer to think was the truth, is that he was showing us a lesson. That you need to ask, and don't let your mind fool yourself, so ask repeatedly. And you'll find that if you do, so that you're not letting wishful thinking get in there. Now, of course, I'd love to think he wanted me out there, but never mind. The guidance, you begin to feel very clearly here. I know when we got that big building in San Francisco, we don't use that building now, we're up in Palo Alto, but it was a huge building. And I called a group of people, about 13 people together, or not many anyway, to see if I could interest them. The down payment was huge. For those times it was huge. I think it was 13,000, whatever it was a lot. And Danny, who was one of our people there, was sitting in the back of the room thinking, this is madness, this is absolute madness. We didn't have that kind of money. And yet I felt it was what we should do. And sure enough, it worked out perfectly. But I had felt Master's blessing on that place. Another thing, when we got the East-West bookstore, it was in Menlo Park then, now it's in Mountain View. And the owner, Lillian Scharfman, asked me one day, it was a metaphysical bookstore, asked me if Ananda would be interested in buying it. She said, I'm getting old and I want to retire and I want to give it, it to be bought by some group that I like. And so she asked me and I said, well, I'll think about it. But I didn't feel anything. And so I didn't say yes. Well, a few months later I was in there and she asked me again. Suddenly I felt inside, this is right. Well, it's easy to say yes. It's very easy to deliver. We had to come up with a down payment of, I think it was $45,000. And Ananda is not a rich place. $45,000 then was a huge amount. But I felt it, and so I said, okay. Well, we had less than 2 weeks before we had to close. We got a check from somebody who didn't know our predicament for $37,000. And other people pitched in, and we were able to come up with that $45,000. Well, the next thing, obvious thing, was the question. The people I was wanting to put in charge there said to me, but we don't know anything about books. Well, that is a normal question, I would say. How can we sell books when we've never sold books before? Well, I answered, well, you don't need to you don't need to know. Your customers will teach you about books. What you can be is a friend. You can give them God's love. You can transfer God's love to them. Don't think of it as a business. Think of it as an act of service in God's name. And so they said, well, we can do that. And you know, it's a place that people began soon coming to, even if they didn't have any books to buy, because they liked being there. They liked the atmosphere. They liked the people. And so East-West Bookstore soon became one of the most prominent in the country, and now it's very much one of the best-known metaphysical bookstores in America, but always based on that principle. Feel first, and feel love for the work that you do, the people that you serve. So when I say Divine Mother, when I'm asked what part does Divine Mother play in Ananda, it is indeed, I don't tell people pray to Divine Mother, but it is that love aspect of God that is very important. We need to love God in one another. And the more we love God in one another, the more life becomes a symphony of joy. And you just feel, when you see suffering, you feel the desire to help these people, and not to inflict your help on them, but to give them what they want if they ask for it. And life is so wonderful when you can have friends everywhere, which is what it becomes, that perfect strangers come to you and want to know you, want to get to know more about you, want to know, they begin sharing their troubles. I had this lovely experience in Paris, France. I went to a concert. I was placed behind the altar because the audience was seated below and it was completely full. There were no chairs there. In fact, they'd been trying to close the door on quite a few people, 50 people outside. And I said, but it's my birthday, c'est mon anniversaire. And the man said, oh, alors, come inside. And happy birthday. And so he put me there. And I say this because I was visible to the audience, and I was feeling so much bliss from the music. And later I was on the metro, the underground, and some old woman came up to me and she said, do you remember me? And I said, well, no, actually not. But I was in the audience. But here this woman out of 700 people felt a connection. Well, that's what you feel more and more, because what they're really seeing is themselves. Everybody's looking for himself. The ideal that he has of what he'd like to be. I had a man came to me in Australia years ago, and he said, well, I'm an atheist. He said, what can you say about God that would impress me? I paused a moment and I said, well, why don't you think of God as the highest potential you can imagine for yourself? And he paused a moment. He was sort of shocked. He was expecting a totally different answer. And he said, well, I can live with that. But this is the truth. We're running around the universe looking for ourselves. That's all we're really looking for. We're looking for that reflection of our potential. And suddenly something clicks. And it may click only part way, but you're attracted to people who help that. You're attracted to people who have something that you want. That's why men and women want each other. Because men are too intellectual, women are too emotional. And if they balance it out, feeling and reason become balanced. So they're attracted to the opposite. What they really are looking for is their own self, that which they lack. But remember, all that you're looking for is that self. Like this musk deer that Yogananda used to talk about, that at a certain season in the year, it secretes in a pouch in its navel the odor of musk. And it is maddened by the beauty of this fragrance. It runs everywhere trying to find it. And sometimes it'll leap from a tall precipice to its death. And the hunter will go and gather that and sell it as a very costly spice, incense, in the marketplace. And the poet writing about this said, oh, musk deer, if only you had understood that the fragrance you were looking for was in your own self. You were producing that fragrance, and you don't know it. Well, to seek Divine Mother is merely a way of objectifying something that still is you, that perfect love, that perfect compassion, that perfect forgiveness. We need to know how to forgive ourselves. So many times when people err, they hit themselves, they kick themselves, they think, why am I so bad? You're not bad. Naughty or good, you're a child of the infinite. Don't think in terms of your mistakes. Yogananda used to say, a saint is a sinner who never gave up. All of us, at some time or another, have done everything, including Larry, who was a pirate at one time. We've done so many things. Learn to forgive that in this sense, not to excuse it. I don't mean that, but forget it. Master said, give everything to God, your virtues, but even your faults. If you make an error, say, God, you did that. Master said, God likes that. He doesn't, not if you do it in a sense of blame, no. Not in a sense of shirking your responsibility, no. But understand that the divine has created all these things ultimately to understand that the secret of life is love. The secret of life is joy and bliss. And the more you live in that, the more you realize. You know, a famous opera singer came to me once from France. And she said, I have an alto voice, and because of that, I'm always given the heavy part. And she said, how can I, because I meditate, I practice Kriya Yoga, but how can I keep divine consciousness when I keep having to play villains? And I meditated on it a second. I thought, well, you know, at a certain point in every soul's evolution, it reaches Larry's piracy and so on. And he has to clear all that up and remember what he did and not say, oh, I did that, what a horrible person I am, but God played that part and release it again into the infinite, just one of the waves on the surface of the ocean. And if you can think of your role, I said, when you're playing these parts of the villainous, and if you can think of that as just a past life that you're reliving in order to release it. And she tried it. She said that many people said afterwards that they were inspired by hearing her play a villainous. Well, that is inspiring when you can feel that it's God who does everything. So the Divine Mother is a very different concept from an idol on an altar. The Divine Mother is an aspect of your own self. That aspect which is tender, kindly, compassionate. A lot of women aren't like that, but Divine Mother always is like that. It says in one of the poems of Shankaracharya, bad sons there are many, but never has there been a bad mother. And I've heard a lot of Hindus repeat that saying to me, thinking that human mothers are never bad. Read the stories of history. But there has never been a bad Divine Mother. That no matter what you do, she is always good. She doesn't blame you. She says, come on, get out of this. Why do you limit yourself? Why do you hold yourself to what causes you more pain than anybody else? Because the truth is that no matter how you hurt others, the pain is much greater for you. You may try to drown it and say, no, I won't see it, but it isn't so. There was something I heard recently about somebody who had committed some very great crime. And he had so much pain later. At the time he felt justified. But there's something in you. You need to overcome the pain too. And finally just give it all to God. Honestly, I don't know how anybody can live without God. They can't anyway. But to think of all the shame, the guilt, the wrong that you have committed in your life, I say you personally, because I say it to me and I say it's true for everybody. We wouldn't be here. As Sri Yukteswar said, if a person is too good for this world, he's adorning some other world. No. We've all done something, many things, but we haven't done it. If we can reach that point where that divine compassion says, forget it. You are a part of perfection. You are infinitely pure. And this was just a dream that you had for a while. You'll wake up from it. But the more you affirm that it's a dream, the more you affirm that your reality is that love, that compassion, the more you'll see that it's possible to get out of delusion. Whereas the more you affirm your delusion, the worse it is. So, what was I going to say there? Yes, so many religions today. I was talking with somebody from Syria yesterday, a very nice man, but I was sort of thinking about how religion deals with guilt. And in one way or another, it affirms its reality. In one way or another, by affirming that reality, it encourages it. Master was one time at a big revival meeting, and the woman, whatever you call them, pastor or whatever, stood there and said, you are all sinners, get down on your knees. Yogananda said later, I was the only one who wasn't kneeling because I wouldn't admit that I am a sinner. He said, the greatest sin is calling yourself a sinner. You can say, yes, I have sinned, okay. Yes, I've made mistakes, better still. But don't say, I am that. Don't identify yourself with who you seem to be, but realize that you're still just a little spark off the anvil of infinity. Okay, now another question somebody asked. Got the Legion of Honor and all sorts of things because he found oil there and so on. And so he lived there 7 years, and I, living in Los Angeles, kept thinking, well, gee, they're pretty close to Switzerland where I went to school, and the best chocolate in the world was in Switzerland. And I kept thinking, I really want to write to them and ask them if they would send me some chocolate, Swiss chocolate. But it was really not an important desire, so much not so that I never even remembered to include it. Just a little thought, it would be nice. But then, 1 week before my birthday, I thought, oh dear, it's my birthday coming up, and I haven't asked them, and now it's too late. And so I just put it aside. I said, Divine Mother, I gave it to Divine Mother. I said, it's your problem. I'm not worried about it. I just give the desire to you. Well, the day before my birthday, I got a package from somebody in our church in Hollywood, and it said that I was passing a store and I saw these Swiss chocolates. I didn't know you could find Swiss chocolate in America. You couldn't at that time. And I thought of you and had a desire to send it to you. And I got this box of Tobler chocolates. And I thought, Divine Mother, I mean, if I can understand how, if you really want me to serve you, you're going to save my life if I'm attacked by something. But when it's something so trivial as chocolate, why you would even think of me? It was more touching to me to receive this box of chocolates than to have my life saved. Because it shows love. That's what God does for you. I remember I was on the freeway up above San Francisco, Palo Alto that way, this Skyline Drive, and driving along, and all of a sudden, boop, 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 I'd run out of gas. I'd forgot to look at my gas gauge. And I thought, well, Divine Mother, it's your thing. I saw there was an exit, so I turned toward the exit. There was a slope, so I kept going with the slope, and I coasted for 2 miles. Then I saw a gas station and pulled in, still coasting, pulled up in front of the pump, the car stopped. How many times? And listen, then you think, why is God doing this to me? Because you have to go through suffering, you have to go through tests, it's a part of it all. And there are times when you think, God, why'd you do this to me? But later on you look back and you think it was the best thing, the only thing that could have happened. God does. He wants to help you, and even through pain, He does help you. And we need lessons sometimes. A child needs spanking sometimes, and sometimes you have past karma to be paid off. I have seen at Ananda, and we've been through so many tests, I have seen 2 things. One, that every test was a great blessing. And the other thing I've seen is this. Because Ananda itself is a a great laboratory. People of all kinds come there. They love God, they want truth. Yes, that's the thing they have in common, but not everybody's ready to live in a selfless way. Many people think, well, but first me, what's in it for me? And you have these different attitudes. But the wonderful thing about a laboratory is that you get to see people over the years. And after 33 years that we've been going, as I look back, I can see that always those people who thought first of themselves, who were selfish, who didn't open their hearts to others enough, who always held back, lots of different things that everybody has in one way or another, but those who did, somehow they never grew. And those who opened themselves and thought, well, okay, I don't know where the money's coming from, but I'm going to serve God. They've always been protected. They've always been sustained. And I've seen that there's got to be a law working here. It can't be that God says, oh, well, you've got a label Ananda, okay, I'll do it for you. No. When your attitude is right, then everything seems somehow, He'll take you to the precipice, but He won't let you fall. I have seen it. Vidura and Durga have seen it. You've seen it. It's happened again and again. And so you come to see that there is a law here. It's not just pleasant sort of wishful thinking. All I'm asking of you is don't believe a word I'm saying. But try the experiment. That's all. You can never know if it's true or not until you've proved it to yourself. But if in your life you can say, okay, a little of my life I want to open to God. There's this lovely story of Rabindranath Tagore. It's a poem in which there's this beggar who goes out every day and begs and gets a little bit of rice, a little bit of whatever. And one day he sees this golden chariot and the King of Kings is coming. And he thinks, oh, if only that king would stop by my house, I could beg everything from him. And the chariot does stop. And the king gets down. And the beggar thinks, oh, what will he give me? Horror of horrors. This King of Kings extends his hand. He says, what have you to give me? And the beggar thinks, I give to a king? What have I got to give? And he didn't know what to do. He was completely embarrassed, confused. But he went into his hut and he had a little pile of rice. That's all he had. And he took one grain of rice and gave it to the king. And the king thanked him and drove on. That day after the beggar came back, and he looked at the rice that people had given him, he found there was one golden grain of rice. And he thought, oh, if only I had given him all my rice. But you will see that the least little thing you give to God becomes golden, becomes holy, becomes a blessing. And if you give your life to God, how much more? But try the experiment. I don't ask you to jump off a precipice, but take one foot. And you'll see that it works, so you'll take another. And bit by bit, you'll find yourself running. That's what grace is about. Yes, you have to make the effort. You have to earn that grace. But you don't do it. God's grace gives it to you, but He doesn't give it free. You have to make the effort to discover that I didn't do anything. And then when you discover that, you realize He's doing it all. Then it's He and you working together. Look at the great masters. They've attained everything, as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita. And even so they work on, because that's a part of the play of God. When you work in the consciousness of God, work in His joy, then you find that everything around you becomes blessed. There's a beautiful song, I think it was written by Handel. What is it? The idea of it is, anyway, that where God's love and light and presence are, everything flourishes. And when God isn't there, no matter how you work, everything dies. I believe we're coming to a time when a lot of things are going to die, because I believe that this country has become too greedy. I believe there is much too much thought of how can I become rich, how can I have a huge stock market investment, how can I have a huge bank account and a big home and a yacht and this thing and that thing. People are forgetting God. We need to help bring that thought out in people, but they will suffer until they too decide it isn't worth it. What's the point of all this money? What is it giving you? When I was 16, my dad wanted to give me a tuxedo. I said, Dad, I'll never earn enough money to pay income tax. I don't want a tuxedo. And that's really been true. I haven't earned it for me. I've earned a lot, but not for me. That's so much happier to live that way. Just let it be His. And you'll find that somehow things flow wonderfully. Well, I'm talking longer than usual, than it's expected, than announced. Who cares? If you don't, I don't. And, yeah, thank you. What is that one? I've already read that one. Let's see here. How does one become more attuned with spirit to understand which devotion, is that devotion? Direction, sorry. I should take in this physical world? Well, it's like everything else, difficult and simple. Difficult because people look for all the other solutions possible. Simple because there's really only one, God. The more you live for Him, the more clarity will come in your life. And if you don't know which path, don't say, well, then I can't follow any path. Follow something that's good. You yourself will develop, and in that developing, you'll understand. Everything becomes clear the closer you come to God. Could you explain how I can grow spiritually, sharing... oh, I've got it here, all right. I'll tell you something. I had laser surgery on my eyes, and it's changed everything. I used to be able to read. Now and so I try to tell myself, and sometimes I do it successfully, and sometimes I failed miserably. How could you explain how I can grow spiritually, having physical weaknesses and health problems? My body draws me down, but my soul is thirsty for God's love and light. This comes to all of us sooner or later. It's certainly come to me sometimes. It's really, there's a very good book by one of our members, Nancy Mayer. It's called Grace. And in this book, when she was younger, she used to ski and was a very expert skier. But at one point, I think it was, broke her ankle. And so she couldn't get out on the slopes, and it was worrying her because before very long, the snow would melt and she would lose a whole year in developing these particular maneuvers that she was wanting to become expert in. There she was, bedridden. So, mentally, she made herself think herself through the movements that she'd need in order to perfect those movements on the ski slope. And for 2 or 3 weeks, when she couldn't move, she went through these movements only mentally. Then, when she was able to get out on the slopes, she found that she had gained as much skill as if she had been out there practicing physically. You see, finally, what's more important is our mind. And if we do things mentally that we can't do physically, ultimately we're doing it physically too. In our next lives, we'll be born with a good body if we resist that. And if we die with the thought of disease and debility and so on, we'll be born disabled because that habit stays with us. The more just lying in bed, you can still love God. Some people have gained the most spiritually when they were incapacitated. The life of St. Francis of Assisi is very good as an example. He was a young man, wanted to be, he was sort of taken with the troubadour spirit of those times, and he sort of envisioned himself going around singing songs of love and everything, and he entered into the spirit of knighthood. And when Perugia and Assisi went to war, he joyfully joined the army and went out there, and somehow became ill and had to come back without being able to fight. And for months he was completely bedridden, high fever, unable to do all these glorious feats that he dreamed of. But that was God's opportunity. God stopped him in his tracks. He couldn't do anything. And in that time he began to rethink his life and think, well, what is it all about? And that's when he realized what he wanted was God and wanted to be a troubadour for God. And this is what sickness can do for you. There is no catastrophe so great that it cannot be turned to your advantage. And your sickness and so on, sure, it's an obstacle, but if you've got it, it's what you've got. Work with that reality. God's on the other side helping you. And whatever you've got, God will bless you if you try to live more in Him, put your thoughts more in Him, love Him more. He will give you what you need. Sooner or later, yes, we all have to go. But I remember this woman whom I heard about. I never met her. She died before I came to Yogananda. But she was a helper in the church there, and didn't seem to be anybody who was very spiritual, just a good woman. And she had an illness at the end of her life, and she was lying there on what proved to be her deathbed for at least 2 weeks. God didn't let her die. And this person told me that every time I would visit her, I would see in her eyes a growing clarity, as if she was saying to God, well, I would have liked to do that, but it doesn't matter, I give it to you. And the more of her desires and attachments she shed in the process, the more she began to shine. And at the very end of her life, she suddenly said, oh, Swamiji is here. And Master Yogananda was standing at the foot of her bed smiling, and she left her body. What you do, if you do your best, God knows, don't worry about it. But do your best, don't use it as an excuse. And you'll see that God is there waiting for you with open arms. His grace is there. You have to do your best, but in the end, it's all His grace. So the yogis, the Christian fundamentalists, the Hindu fundamentalists, all these people, some who talk of self-effort, some who talk of grace, they're saying the same thing, they just don't know it. It's all God. You have to offer yourself to Him. That's where effort comes in. The more you can offer, the more He receives.